Good afternoon. This is the Accessibility and Disability Policy webinar series. Today we have with us Susan O'Brien of the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, who will be talking to us about the importance of Braille. Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Randy, very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So delighted that you are joining us. My presentation, Got Braille, is going to cover why learning and using Braille is still relevant in the electronic age. I work at the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I'm a Braille transcriber, adapted materials specialist, in addition to providing Braille resources and tactile graphics and 3D materials for our students and teachers at our school. I also develop and facilitate in training statewide for TVIs and transcribers across Texas. We're going to have two parts today. At first, I want to address this through really the components of literacy. And on the second part of today's session, I want to talk about supporting tactile learning. Both I feel are important parts of learning and using Braille. So we will begin today with part one, components of literacy. In kind of a general, we're going to start out talking kind of generally, but I wanted to begin with a question that I get. Actually, I feel like I get this a little bit too often. And my first reaction when I hear it is, the question is how, if I'm asked is Braille still relevant, or actually it's sometimes phrased, with all the smart devices available today, does a student really need to learn Braille? My first reaction is always to kind of cringe, but then I realize that the person asking is always well-intentioned. They just don't understand the importance of Braille for people with blindness. Often the question is followed by a list of all the devices available, mention of the internet and all the information online and the great number of books and other materials that are available today in an auditory format. The problem is they just haven't thought about what literacy means and aren't thinking about all the skills involved in becoming or being literate. So I would like to start with kind of a little bit of a definition of literacy. It's a word that's kind of changed in meaning over the years. Its root is in French, and at first it just meant well-educated or learned. And it just has evolved a little bit later to include the ability to read and write. But today it has a much broader usage and includes a wider range of skills. And these can change somewhat depending on the discipline perspective of the person you're talking to. For instance, psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, and education all have slightly different concepts of what it means to be literate, but we're going to talk more about the educational standpoint today. At first, it seemed to we talked about the oral tradition, which is actually a very ancient practice. It's found in all cultures. Information was passed on through the generations using folklore. History was passed on, customs, and of course traditions. And we often see this kind of customs and tradition and family history passed on through our families still like this today. So it's still the practice of oral tradition still continues. Today we have some more modern venues, for instance, TED Talks, lectures like at our local libraries, TV, audiobooks, songs, movies, and still, like I said, informally through our families. What I think is important to mention is that if anything, technology has really enhanced this oral tradition, and we have many increased opportunities. but we know it's not the only modality available for learning. But I do want to make a point here that research shows that audiobooks impact literacy in a very powerful and positive way. And I want to just highlight that a little bit more. So I think, can we go to the next slide, please? There are some studies out there that show that audiobooks really improve literacy. And a study I've just run across, I added this particular slide just this morning, was San Francisco Bay Area schools had a study using Tails to Go, which demonstrated a 58% annual gain in reading achievement in just 10 weeks, using no other innovation or interventions. They found that the areas that improved considerably were comprehension, vocabulary, and the motivation to read. So I would like to also mention that Renee Toy, our library at TSBVI, has really encouraged the use of audiobooks at our school. And we see, and of course this is anecdotal, but we too have noticed an overall greater interest in reading Braille through audiobooks. This is, and this matches the research we're seeing, which also indicates that students need a choice. And I want to give you just kind of a little, an incident that happened several years ago that really showed us how important this is. One of our students had been listening to a series of audiobooks on, of course, everything was vampires and zombies and post-apocalyptic scenarios. And when the fourth one came out, it was not available. We couldn't get the file for Braille. And or we couldn't get the audio file. He'd been listening to the audiobooks, but we could get a print file and create a Braille file. And he told Renee, he said, I want to read that book so bad, I'll read it in Braille. And that became a big turning point in his Braille reading skills. And he often asked for Braille books after that. So it's a good foundation, and it's a good way to get kids interested in stories and reading. So reading, it's a skill that we probably primarily identify with literacy. We also know it's a very complex process that includes many skills. For anyone interested in just reading, the skills involved in reading fluently, you can Google that, and you'll see the breakdown of sub-skills required to be a fluent reader is almost overwhelming. When we look at the research in the brain science and education and start to see how much our minds are doing in order for us to be fluent readers, it's almost overwhelming. But the development of these same skills that we see for our sighted children are just as necessary for the Braille reader, but there's an additional skill set required on top of that, and that is the tactile skills. And that's why we're going to address tactile skill development. It's the latter part of this session. Okay, and one of the third skills that we saw listed was writing. And we know that reading and writing are interconnected. For some, as you read, you'll find they consider writing to be the opposite side of the same coin as reading. And we know it's defined as the ability to produce text on paper or on a screen today, whether it's an iPad, texting on their phone, or a computer. We know that writing helps lead to a person's comprehension. It allows us to organize our thoughts. How many of us could go without writing a list? How many of you doodle ideas on scraps of paper or napkins? So writing allows us to put our thoughts and our ideas in a concrete form. It also gives us, when we're doing schoolwork or writing papers, that ability to edit what we are working on. But we also know studies show us that improving a student's writing ability also improves their learning capacity and their comprehension. So now let's turn to Braille, and I want to give you kind of a short historical perspective of Braille and show how it kind of fits into skills for literacy. I just want to mention now before I go into talking about Braille that last week our warehouse found an embossed print book that was published by the American Printing House for the Blind in the late 1880s. This book, it was embossed print. A serif font was used, so that's one of those with little tails and curly cues. And I'm guessing, it was hard to tell exactly, but it looked like it was about a 20-point font. The page size was comparable to about the 11.5 by 11-inch Braille paper. It was very difficult to read, even with sight. The serif font made it difficult. And just looking at it, I found it difficult to imagine how someone who is blind learned to read using embossed print. It just seemed like a very cumbersome way. Just looking at some of the letters was difficult to discern one from the other. So now a brief history of Braille. We know that the concept of reading with dots on a page did not start with Louis Braille, but it began with Charles Barbier. He was a French army captain, and he developed a system he called night writing, and it was a system of writing for the troops that they could do in the dark and silently. It didn't seem to work. It was never widely adopted by the French military. The other thing I found out in some of my reading is that Barbier had actually developed about a dozen different codes. And I'm not sure that any of the other ones were ever used. It wasn't until 1821 that someone suggested that maybe he take it to the Royal Institute for the Blind, that they may find it useful. And that is where he met Louis Braille. And Louis Braille, as we know, then took the system and made substantial improvements to the night writing code. And it's also interesting to note that Charles Barbier was not happy about his code being changed, that he felt it was fine just the way it is. But there were some very serious problems with it that would make it a very inefficient method of reading and certainly for writing. It didn't fit under the fingertips. It was configured with 2 columns of 6 dots, so a symbol could have 12 dots. Also, translation was sort of a 2-step process, and this is very interesting. First of all, if you were going to translate a message into night writing, the first step was that you had to translate the original message into kind of a quasi-phonetic spelling, and you matched symbols in a grid. It was 6 by 6. Some of these symbols were letters, some of them were digraphs, and some of them were trigraphs. In total, there were 36 symbols. Very complicated. So some of the articles that I read suggested that when people with different dialects were doing this first translation step, that it could vary from person to person exactly how they translated it into this quasi-phonetic type spelling. So outcomes were not necessarily the same, and it depended on who was translating it that step. And then again, at the final step, the person who was reading it and interpreting it, again, it could be different from what the original message intended. And so this is probably a good indication why it was not widely accepted by the military. So what Louis Braille did was absolutely brilliant. The changes he made to the code are so functional that it is still capable of representing print today. And the changes were that he just made it 6 dots and they fit under a fingertip. That there was a letter to symbol relationship, and also the code that he developed, you were able to produce punctuation and numbers, and this was something that was not done in night writing. And I want you to think about this, as the code has not changed today. The basic foundation of the Braille code, that letter to symbol relationship, is still there. So what is truly amazing about this is today we have the Unified English Braille code, and that has simply extended the ability of Braille's code by the use of indicators. So to me, this is truly amazing. This is just so amazing to look at. The foundation of that code is still the same. We've just kind of used some new symbols to extend the meaning of the code. Very interesting. So I want to just revisit our reading skills for just a second. We can see now, looking at Braille, we can see that decoding is possible with that letter to symbol relationship. This supports those skills of decoding, which leads to fluency and also the development of vocabulary. Also with punctuation, sentence construction is possible. Reasoning is supported through the ability to create words, sentences, and to develop a sense of numeracy. We could now use, Braille can be used to produce numbers, mathematical expressions. So the difficulties that were present in night writing system for working memory and attention, they were eliminated by reducing the size of the cell to 2 columns of 6 dots. Excuse me. But here's kind of, I think, one of the most amazing things about Braille. Prior to having the Braille code, there wasn't really an efficient system of writing for people who were blind. So, as I said before, Braille students who were blind were taught to read through embossed letters. It was very costly. There was very few books or materials available to them, and they basically had no system of writing. So students, how did they analyze their work? How did they plan? How did they revise? How did they edit things? So we can see that although students would still be able to learn, it would be much more difficult and it would be a much slower process. So we can see that Braille is truly an avenue to literacy, that those same skills that students accomplish as print readers, that Braille students can accomplish those same things. Being able to write and express oneself regardless of the contents, whether it's an assignment for school, a task, or project at work, or whether it's just for personal enjoyment, is it's amazing to have that ability. So before we move on, I just want to say the answer to that question in the beginning is yes, Braille is still relevant in a very digital world. And I want to conclude this first part of our session today with a quote from Richard Vaca. He said that as adolescents entering the adult world in the 21st century will read and write more than at any other time in human history. They will need advanced levels of literacy to perform their jobs, run their households, act as citizens, and to conduct their personal lives. Richard Vaca is the author of Content Area Reading, Literacy, and Learning Across the Curriculum. And he's really talking about how important these skills are moving forward for us. Therefore, our students with blindness should continue to have full access to Braille as their avenue to this advanced level of literacy that's going to be required in the future. Now, does this mean that a student always has to have and be toting around, volumes of hard copy Braille books? No. The good news is today that we also have refreshable Braille displays, and these are becoming more and more commonplace. I think what we're hoping for the future is that these things will come down in price so that they can be even more widely available. But these devices provide students and adults with the ability to be as mobile and agile in their learning and their work as their sighted peers.
I just wanted to let you know, Susan, right now we don't have any questions after this first section, but if anyone has a question, please post it to the Q&A box, and Susan will be happy to address it. Nothing yet, so I guess we move on, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So part 2, we're going to talk about supporting tactile learners and developing tactile skill, because this was that additional skill that our students with blindness need to develop in order to become fluent readers. And first I want to address kind of the components of tactile skill. Of course, there's motor skill, cognitive skill, and sensory skill, and we'll see that these things really kind of work together, mesh together, and a development in all 3 of these areas is needed. But it's very important that we understand that the development of these skills are truly needed by students in order to become proficient, not only at reading Braille, but also tactile graphics. We know that many of our books, our textbooks, educational material, other material are full of visual graphics today. And a student needs to be able to read these as well as just the Braille itself. So to begin with, let's address motor skill development. And this seems like it should be just kind of happening, but it doesn't. You know, as I work with students, I start to see a deficiency in these skills frequently. And some of the common skills are that grasp and release ability, rotary motion, you know, that ability to take covers on and off. That is such an important skill. Finger isolation, being able to use both hands, hand and finger strength, tactile discrimination, the ability to do a light touch, proper finger position for Braille, which is really helped develop by their TVI, and of course that ability to be able to tactily track across a page or to systematically explore a page if it's a tactile graphic. Now let's talk a little bit about the functional application of these skills. We want students to be able to locate objects, you know, either randomly finding something on a table in front of them or intentionally searching for an object. We also want them to develop that ability to explore an object, to get information about it by being able to move their hands and their fingers over the object. Manipulating objects, you know, the intentional movement of an object. And this one I want to say is so important because this is how we figure out how things work or move. And just not about 2 weeks ago, I had a situation where a student had a thumb drive that was a little unusual. It slid kind of the part that inserted into the computer had a cover that kind of slid over the top of it and then would slide back in order to put it into the computer. But the part that slid over it was kind of protection for when it was being stored. And the student didn't realize that it moved, and so he thought he broke it. But it's like they should have lots of experience with these things because they're common objects. And also we want them to recognize objects, to be able to associate an object with a memory of maybe using it before. We want them to be able to compare things. We want them to notice similarities or be able to make note of the differences and to actually develop a preference. Matching and sorting things, very important. And also the ability to communicate using objects to request, refuse, comment, question, for choice making, and for calendars. These are usually often very early skills, but very important ones too. And also, even more important, organizing. Being able to find objects in their usual place and returning them to a place. Being able to sort them or categorize them, by placement, function, attribute, gathering materials for a task before they start, and being able to organize those materials so that they use them in the order that they're needing them, or to have a way in their mind of doing it so they know where things are. It makes them more efficient. But a lot of these, they need to have time to do this, and they need to have exposure to doing this on a regular basis. And cognitive skill. They need lots of experience with real objects before they can come to understand that objects can be represented in, say, graphic or tactile form. And then the skills they need once they get to that point where they understand that a graphic representation can be made in a two-dimensional, like a tactile graphic, or a solid embossed shape. They need to be able to use their fingers. We talked about that light touch, or that being able to systematically explore outlines or raised lines or broken lines. They need to be able to read the symbols or the letters that might be a key on that graphic. And for the creation of that, graphics are made from lines, points, various shapes, and Braille labels. But if a student does not have that experience with real objects, it becomes very difficult to make that transition to, there is no transition. It's difficult to figure out what it is on paper when you haven't had that hierarchy of skill development addressed. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the hierarchy of tactile skill development. First of all, they need a great deal of awareness of textures and shapes. And in order to get that, they need opportunities for contacts with lots of different materials and lots of shapes. They need experience handling real objects and not just plastic or paper. Sometimes I feel when I'm creating tactile graphics that, we're limited into what kind of material we can use, but I try to use a variety of textures when it's appropriate, because I would like it to be, tactily interesting, something that draws their attention to the graphic, just as visually a textbook or a worksheet has these illustrations or has these graphics on there. It's to engage the reader. We want them to understand part-whole relationships. They need to, again, manipulate real objects so that they can develop that understanding of their parts and how they form a whole object. And again, it comes to, like, say, the lid on a container. How do they come apart? How do they work? And again, look at the motor skill of that turning the hand that needs to be developed in order to be able to do something like that. And this is something that parents can be working on with young children with the guidance of a TVI. When they're in school, as we're making material, I always tell our transcribers that you need to work very closely with the TVI to find out all you can about the student and their ability. That being a smart student or a good Braille reader doesn't always mean that they have good tactile skill development, because tactile skill is related to concept development and spatial awareness. And also there may be some cases where this ability and the development of this is impacted by the student's etiology, the cause of their eye condition. Another part of this, again, is that graphic representation. You know, develop that understanding that a raised line drawing can represent a real object. That's a difficult skill, and I would like to ask, or just want you to think about this for a minute. We know it's difficult even for some people with sight to be able to look at a 2D representation of an object and make sense of it. And so let me ask you this: how many of you have ever looked at blueprints and then from the blueprint can visualize what the building or the floor plan represents? This is the same type, and if you have difficulty doing it, this is the same type of thing that, that students face. So making that association between the real object and a graphic is a huge leap, and it's made more difficult, if not impossible, if the student hasn't had that experience with real objects. And also keep in mind that the development of this skill, and especially spatial awareness, is very important to many other areas of the student's life as well. It may impact their mobility also. Now notice all four of these were listed as separate skills, but as they're being developed, they lead to an ability to read and comprehend well-made tactile graphics. Students also should be encouraged at times to create their own. In mathematics, they can create number lines very easily. With some of the materials we have today, they can actually create some other drawings also on a draftsman. I also want to say, and this is important too, when their materials are being made, why standardization is important. Lack of consistency in how things are created for them can really impact their reading and their comprehension. So they need to be seeing things made according as closely to our guidelines and standards as possible, or as they're learning, the goal should be to get them to that point. Because remember that deciphering, whether it's Braille or a tactile graphic, is not a skill of reading, and deciphering is different from decoding. Movement and sensory exploration pretty much go together. The process for sensory development should start very early, and it certainly does in children who are sighted. Motor and sensory skills must be developed before higher learning behavior and academic changes can take place in students. Think of it as this is kind of a, I kind of drew this from my readings. Think of it as kind of a feedback loop. As a youngster encounters items that kind of stimulate their sensory system, through movement, this kind of encourages more movement and more sensory exploration, and that's the kind of system that we want to get started for them. It kind of, and we don't even understand all of the ways that this encourages brain development. So we need to encourage as much of it as possible for our students. And of course, sensory development is based on all of these areas of the body and all of these senses developing. And we can see that vision is just one of these, that there's many other areas that students can be stimulated through their sensory system. You know, hearing, smell, taste, touch, inner ear, proprioception, that whole ability to know where one is in space as they're moving, and of course balance and that sense of spatial perception is so important. Now I put this one in here just as an example of why real objects are important. This, believe it or not, comes from a 5th grade math problem where the object was to figure out the volume of a cylinder or of the cone. But if you have not had experience with either a cone and handled one in real life or a cylinder, what sense does finding the volume of these? The other part of it is, for reading this graphic, is understanding that, especially on the cylinder, is that dashed line in the back of it, that can't be seen when we're looking at the cylinder. And so they need to understand that that's just part of the drawing. But without kind of real life experience with these objects, it doesn't make much sense. The drawing itself does not make much sense. Once they have experience with real objects, it's easier to make that transition to a 2D graphic. So we want to talk a little bit about opportunities for skill development. We want to provide lots of opportunities for exploration in daily life, and also exploration in areas where things make sense, like tools. Visiting a hardware store might be a great way to explore this if you don't have them at home. Also, art supplies, and letting students draw, paint, Play-Doh. And again, it's not just the final product they produce that is important, although I think you never know if you have a budding artist or not, but it's that fine motor skill development that we give these opportunities to other students. So why shouldn't our children have the same? Craft activities, weaving pot holders, sewing. Again, these are very fine motor skills, but they need to be developed. And toys. There are lots of toys that also would encourage the use of fine motor skills in their development. Legos, which are a favorite, I think, of children of all ages. Magnetics. We have magnets in the library that are of different shapes: triangles, squares, rectangles that can be fashioned together. And also blocks. All of these things are great ways for students to be developing fine motor skills and give them an opportunity to explore how things work and how they don't work. So some of the things we're doing at TSBVI to encourage this kind of learning for our students: we have a makerspace in our library. And if ever you're visiting, you're welcome to come by and see it. But makerspaces are becoming more often in libraries in the communities, and also a lot of schools are now developing their own makerspaces, and they're great places to learn and to explore, and safety, of course, is always a part of that. Now at TSBVI, you can see a variety of hand tools. We also have a few power tools, and but we also have, in addition to this type of material for building and creating, we also have almost you could say no tech involved, and that's the yarns and fabrics, and also in this area our Legos and our magnets, and there's like these straws that stick together. So we have lots of a variety, but we also have high-tech items in our library for students to work with too. So it just depends on their skill level where they're at. And it's amazing now, every once in a while as I walk into the library, it's very common, especially in the afternoon, to hear sounds of drilling, sawing, pounding, as students work together with their teachers to create projects. So we do, like I said, have both no-tech activities and supplies, and also the high-tech activities that include Arduinos, little bits, Those are those snap circuits that students can put together, and quite often the buzzer in there, the one they put together that buzzes, is quite popular, and also like Raspberry Pis. Something else we have at our school, which really helps as kind of that precursor. If we can't have a real object, maybe we make one on our 3D printer. So we also print frequently for students in classrooms. On the left is the Taj Mahal and also Godzilla. They're not together for any reason other than we made both of them. The Taj Mahal was actually one of the first objects we printed at the school several years ago, and it was made for a class that was learning about famous buildings from around the world. As they read about the building, the teacher realized that they had no idea, they had no mental models of quite what this building was like, and she asked if we could have a 3D model printed that she could use in the classroom to help the students be able to feel it as she continued to read that description. Godzilla was made for a teacher who was going to talk to his class about the upcoming movie. And then the moon, that's half of the moon on the right side of the page. We've since printed the lower half too. The two of them are being joined together magnets, and the reason they were printed in two pieces is because of the size of the build plate. And we often have to do that, is print something pieces at a time and then assemble it. This, we've actually had students help us with the assembly by drilling holes in the plastic and inserting magnets. And again, I want to say that just being told about Godzilla is one thing, but being able to feel and explore the model can certainly help someone develop a better idea of what he's like, and maybe helps fire their imagination as they go to the movie. And the Taj Mahal, when you think about this, could any of us really do justice with a verbal or a written description of the unique architectural features of this structure? And can't that really be enhanced if we have a model or something that the student can actually explore with their fingertips as well as listening to or hearing the description of it? Okay, so as kind of an add-on, I wanted to make a plug for TSBVI. Now we have a podcast that comes out, I think, bi-monthly, and it's the Sense of Texas podcast. But on May 15th, our library director at TSBVI, Renee Toy, will be giving some great tips for how to keep your student or your child reading or listening over the summer. She will include where you could find Braille and audio books in her talk. So if you're interested in how to really kind of encourage literacy for your child or your student over the summer, I would encourage you to listen to her podcast. And finally, in conclusion, my part today, I want to just say again that literacy is comprised of multiple skills, and creating an experientially rich environment can aid our learners with blindness and visual impairment to have greater access and opportunities in life, and also it will enhance their skills as a reader, as a writer, as they continue through their educational or their work lives. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today, and I'd gladly take any questions if there are any.
Okay, we do have a question. I wanted to also mention, you had said you have a number of resources at the end of this that individuals will receive because they'll receive the training materials. Do you want to touch real quick on each one of them just because we have time?
Okay.
Or is there anyone in particular you want to emphasize?
Well, the one thing I do want to say is there's one of them that's out of sequence, and that's on the last page, and it says that. It should have been the second one, but that was the one I added this morning. I apologize for that. Um, One of the things that I want to say, many of the articles and studies that I was reading as I prepared for this in general education are all very up to date, written in the last, within the last 10 years, as they should be. One of the things is if you're in this field of visual impairment and blindness, that we could do some research to kind of catch up here. We're kind of extrapolating information that we get from general education to this area, but we kind of need some research. And as you'll see, that Kirschman article is 1976, and I find that I'd really like to encourage anybody interested. Let's do some research. Let's get that going in our area too.
All right. Here's a couple more.
Oh, I would like to say, if you go back to that next slide, that Setting the Stage for Tactile Understanding, the first one on that page by Karen Pope, that's done by APH. That one's out of print, but I do have a copy, and could share that if anybody was interested in it. That's a great publication.
Okay. All right, let me read you one of the questions.
Okay.
I am working with a student who is visually impaired and has mild IDD. The parent has requested Braille instruction. The school stated that they are working with the child to develop her reading skills, and she cannot learn Braille until she masters reading skills. They also stated they don't offer Braille instruction. What can the parent do? And this child has a degenerative eye disease.
Okay. I can't get very specific on that. That's beyond, some of what you're asking is beyond my my expertise. But in the state of Texas, a student should have, through their school district, access to a teacher of the visually impaired, and it should be a joint decision between the parents, the TVI, and the school about establishing Braille reading skills. And if you need some assistance with that, I would contact our outreach department. They have VI consultants that would be glad to work with you and the parents and the school system in order to get what your student would need.
Simply because the school doesn't offer something doesn't mean the child doesn't have a right to that service. I might not have an audiologist on staff, but if we have kids with hearing loss, I'm going to have to make sure they get those services or get diagnosed or whatever. So, yeah, just because they don't have it doesn't mean they don't have an obligation to provide it. So that's a great resource, is contacting somebody there at the school. Is your contact information on any of these slides?
Oh, I guess not.
Okay, I'll add it at the end. That way it's there in case somebody wants to contact you or the
right. And I would certainly then, if they contacted me, I'd put them in touch with who in our outreach department would be very qualified to deal with their question.
And I'll try to remember to add that to the slide.
Okay, sorry. I usually do that, and I don't know why I didn't.
That's okay. Is your podcast in Spanish?
That's a good question. We can find out the answer to that too. Okay. The teacher that recorded it did it in English, but I'm sure that that information can be given to them. Okay.
And do we have any other last questions from any of our participants? I don't see any yet.
You know, the one thing I will say is sometimes I think the person that asked the question about the school district, you know, one of the things that I see in my work is sometimes there's kind of a fear of Braille by those that don't know it or aren't familiar with it. And they don't maybe understand how the student can continue in class reading through a different medium than print. And it's very possible. And so sometimes it might be some education on this person's part. I don't know who was asking the question, but maybe just providing some information is that, you know, many of the students in Texas are being educated in their home districts, and they're receiving Braille services and learning to read and write, and they are participating in classes just like everyone else, and that the classroom teacher does not have to read or write Braille in order for that student to be able to be successful. And that's one reason why we have teachers of the visually impaired working with students. So, you know, sometimes it's just like providing a little bit of you know, information to them to help them understand that, yes, this is entirely possible, you know, for the student to be successful.
So what I gathered too through, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, through your session, is that you don't have to be able to read visually to be able to learn to read using Braille, correct?
That is true. That is true.
That's
We have
what it
many.
kind of sounded like maybe was the theory behind that question.
Yeah.
Which
No, many students who are, you know, born with blindness learn to read Braille, and they become very fluent readers, and they develop all of these literary skills. It's just that they have to be explicitly taught many things that our sighted children just learn incidentally through observation others. And again, one area we didn't cover was, but they can certainly find out more information about that, is the expanded core skills that deals with this whole area of being explicitly taught things that other students pick up through their sight and everyday experiences.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so I want to thank you, Susan, for joining us today, and thank you, Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired as well. I'd also like to thank our captionist, who is Polly with Texas Closed Captioning, providing the real-time captioning services. And with that, we'll go ahead and close for the day. Thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you for having me. I was delighted to do this.
Thank you.